This is a video tutorial for Abbie View B, which is a boho inspired blouse with elasticated cuffs, a clean finished hem with side splits, self-bias binding around the neckline which turns into those little ties, and has gather detail on the upper sleeve. So here we have the cut pieces. That's the binding I'm folding up there. The front is cut one pair. The back is cut one on the fold, and the sleeves, we have the lower sleeve, we have two cut on the fold, and the upper sleeve is cut one pair, so you need a left and a right sleeve. And finally we need the neck tape. I've just cut that from the salvage of the fabric, and I've marked in the positions as per the template. And okay, so what I'm doing here, I've got the front panels. I'm looking for the neck that is a little bit down from the centre front neckline, and there's also a neck at the hem 2 centimetres in from the centre front edge. We're going to sew a 2 centimetre seam from the hem up to that neck. Now 2 centimetres is 3/4 of an inch, and here I am at the machine sewing that 2 centimetre or 3/4 of an inch seam, stopping at the neck. I've pressed that seam open, and now I'm going to clean finish that seam. So clean finishing just means there are no raw edges, no overlocked, serged, or any other sort of edges. So the raw edge is neatly concealed. So I was just folding that raw edge in 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, and now I'm stitching it down. So I'm just doing an edge stitch here, quite close to the folded edge. And the final result will be a really nice, clean, finished centre front seam. So you're going to do that with both sides. And here I am just on the other side. I'm sort of folding as I go. You can press the whole way down if you prefer. I just enjoy the flexibility of folding it in as I sew. Okay, and this time I started at the hem, and I'm going to finish at the neck edge. And then I'm going to give it a really good press. Okay, so here is the inside of the garment. You can see it's really clean looking, and on the outside it will just be a 1 centimetre top stitch all the way down. Now I've got the sleeve panels, so I'm going to do a gathering stitch in between the nicks that are found near the top of the sleeve. So there's one of the nicks there. And I'm just using, to do a gathering stitch, I'm just using a long straight stitch. Okay, and here I have the gathered lower sleeves. And they're the same. The lower sleeve it's not a pair, it's just two the same. So it doesn't matter which one you use to sew to the upper sleeve. So I'm just matching the nicks on the upper and the lower sleeve, and I'm gathering the lower sleeve to fit. Just trying to get nice even gather there. And I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. Just a note about when you do that gathering stitch in the previous step, make sure it is no more than let's say 8 millimeters, or just a bit more than 1/4 of an inch down. So when we come to sew the seam, which I'm doing here, we don't want the gathering stitch to fall below that seam and be visible on the right side of the garment. Okay, so just sewing that 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam, and then I've got an overlocker, so I've just finished that seam with an overlock stitch. If you don't have an overlock, you can just do a zigzag stitch close to the edge. Okay, now I've got my 2 gathered sleeves. I've pressed the seams upwards, and now I've got the back bodice, and I'm going to be matching the double necks on the back bodice and the back edge of the sleeve. So here I'm just pinning the other sleeve. So I've found the double neck on the back of the sleeve, matching it to the bodice, and now I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam. When I come past the sleeve gathering seam there, just making sure that that seam is pointing upwards. That looks nicest on the garment when it's finished. If that seam is pointing upwards towards the neck. Okay, and I'm just sewing the other side 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. And then I'll overlock both of those seams. I've pressed those seams in towards the centre back neck, and this is where it is now. So this is the front panel that I'm getting now. Right sides together, I'm going to sew those front raglan seams. So you'll see that there is a single notch or nick on both the bodice and the sleeve. Okay, I'm going to sew that both sides 1 centimetre. So it's exactly what we've just done with the back, but now we're joining the front. And again, when we go past that seam on the sleeve, which has the gather, we're going to make sure it's pointing up towards the neck. Okay, so that's one side, and now I'm doing the other side. Always make sure that the right sides of the fabric are together when you're sewing the main seams. That's the sleeve seams, the side seams, etc. Okay, and then I'm going to overlock those seams as well and press them in towards the centre front neck this time. Okay, so your garment should be starting to take shape now. The next thing we're going to do is close the side seams. Before we do that, we need to just overlock a small section of the side seam just above the neck on the front panel only. So that's what I'm showing you here. Now, right now I'm pinning the neck close to the hem edge. I'm pinning them together at the underarm point and at the cuff. So we're going to sew a 1 centimetre seam, stopping at that neck near the hem. That's going to form our side splits. Okay, so here I am. I've started at the cuff. Doesn't matter which end you start with. I'm just explaining what I'm doing here. So I've just gone through the underarm point, and you can see that little section of overlocking, and you'll see why that's necessary in a moment. So I'm stopping at that top neck there, and now I need to overlock this side seam, but I need, I'm going to overlock it closed, but I need the lower section to remain open so that I can do the splits. And here's a close-up of what that looks like. Okay, next step is to press the hem edge up front and back 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Now we're going to stitch in the side splits. So we just put right sides of the fabric together. We're folding that hem edge up to meet the side seam there. And now we're going to stitch 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. What we're doing here is we're going to be bagging out these splits. So if you've done a bit of sewing, you would have come across the concept of bagging out, which generally means you're putting right sides together, sewing, and then turning the fabric to the right side. Okay, so I've just sewn both of those splits 5 centimetre, and here I am bagging out, really trying to wriggle those corners so that they're nice sharp points there. And once you've done both sides, so you've bagged out the splits on both sides, you can sew the hem. Just making sure that you've got an even hem depth all the way around. You can press this step first and pin it up if you prefer. I'm just using the guides on my machine to tell me how far to sew in and making sure that it's even all the way along. Okay, and as I go, as I stitch over the opposite side seam to where I began, I'm just going to do a little back tack just to give it a bit of strength there. Okay, and just zooming around this hem. There I'm just poking in any little bits of frayed bits that are poking up. I'm going to push them in so that they're concealed inside the hem. Okay, and a back tack there, and snip. Okay, so you can see how necessary it was to open the lower part of that seam. Some people who sew at home may be used to having open side seams all the way along. You can do that if you prefer. I tend to use industrial methods for garment construction, as is my background, but in my belief there's no right or wrong. Okay, here I'm showing you that we're going to be doing a gathering stitch right around the neckline. So about no more than 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge, preferably a little bit closer to the raw edge. We're just going to use that long stitch length, long straight stitch, and sew right the way around. We're going to use that stitch to gather in the neckline. And this is the tape that I have. Well, it's not really tape, I've just cut a piece, a 5 millimeter wide or less than 6 millimeter wide piece from the selvage of the fabric, because it's nice and light. You just need something that's not stretchy and stable and not too heavy. And I've used the provided template to mark in the positions of the seams. Now I've just folded that tape in half as a guide to see how much to gather in that neckline. I prefer to do the gathering onto the tape at the machine. If you prefer, you can pin it all the way around before you even go to the machine. I find it much easier just to do it this way. There's no right or wrong. Just do what feels comfortable to you. I've got the tape underneath and I've got the gathering on top of the tape. And I'm just using my snips to make sure that I've got an even spread of fabric within that gather. And I'm just making sure that those raglan seams are matching up with the markings on my tape. To mark my tape, I've just used a water erasable pen. You can use chalk, you can use whatever you've got on hand, really. You can even just pin it. I find that a bit fiddly, but okay, and I'm just making sure I've got really even gather all the way around. And just stitching through onto the tape. It's important to keep the tape right close to the raw edge. We're going to be sewing a self-binding onto this neckline, and the binding is not super wide. It'll finish about somewhere between 1/4 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch. So we really need any stitching that you're doing before the binding goes on really needs to be concealed within the binding, otherwise you've got a bit of an unpicking job to do. Okay, and so I'm just showing you the gathered neckline there, and here is my self-bias binding that I've cut out, and I'm going to have a join. So this is how you join bias binding, and you'll just with a tiny seam there, less than 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters, and press it open. And then we're going to press the binding in half with right sides out. Now I'm putting right sides together. I've got the join in the binding, and I'm putting that at the center back of the neckline, and that's where I'm going to start sewing it on. Okay, so I'm sewing a 6 millimeter or 1/4 of an inch seam. Okay, and just stopping at the neck edge there, and then I'm going to go and do the other side. So this time I've got the binding underneath and the garment on top, and I'm just continuing that 6 millimeter seam. Okay, and here is the slightly fiddly part, which is folding the binding in towards the inside of the garment with a clean finish, so you're folding it twice, and pinning it down. So the idea here is that the inside of the binding is sitting below the stitch seam by about 2 millimeters, or roughly an eighth of an inch. And so when you put the pins in, you want to be catching the inside of the binding. And I'm just giving a rough guide to the finished width of the binding here, because sometimes it depends on the fabric that you're using. But it probably will finish somewhere around 6 millimeters or a quarter of an inch. Okay, so I've pinned that binding in all the way around. I could go straight to the machine and stitch the binding down, but I find it really helpful just to do a hand stitch around the neckline. It's just a lot less fiddly, and you're less likely to have like gaps where you haven't caught the binding on the inside properly. So I'm doing pretty long stitches here, so I don't want to take too long to do it. But it's just going to stop that binding moving around on the underneath, because you'll be sewing from the right side of the garment and you won't be able to see the binding, the inside of the garment underneath. Okay, so I'm just showing you that I've done a really long basting stitch basically all around that neckline, catching the binding by about 2 millimeters or an eighth of an inch. Right, so this is one end of the tie here that I am just folding the raw edges in to with the right sides of the binding out. Now this, you could go over to the iron and press this first, but I do find that really quite fiddly unless you've got a handy little tool that folds the binding for you. It's actually quite fiddly to do, so I find it much easier just to fold at the machine. Because it's cut on the bias, it's actually not that hard to do. There's quite a bit of flexibility there, and the fabric sort of it's quite easy, depending on your fabric, of course. This is a lightweight cotton voile that I'm using here, and it's fairly easy to work with. Okay, so I have just stitched along near the edge of the binding there. When I get to the garment, I'm actually going to position my needle just below the seam. So this is called stitching the ditch, if you've heard of that technique before. So you're not sewing on top of the binding, you're sewing directly below it, and you're catching the inside of the binding on the underneath of the garment. So that's why it's really helpful to have that hand basting stitch to ensure that you're catching the binding underneath. Otherwise you're going to have to go back and sort of close up some holes. Okay, and I've come to the other end, and I'm going to be sewing on the edge of the binding as I'm folding the raw edges inwards. And just sewing right to the end. Okay, so with any luck you don't have holes and you've caught all the binding on the inside, and it's looking like this. I'm just going to trim back those ties according to the table in the chart in the spec, and knotting the ends. Okay, so we're going to fold with the cuff edge in 6 millimeters and then a centimeter, which is a quarter of an inch, and then 3/8 of an inch. So we're creating a tunnel or a channel or a casing for the elastic to be threaded through. Again, you could go to the iron and press this first, though I do find when you're pressing double turns that are this small, it can be a little bit tricky. You may wish just to try doing it at the machine. It's not that hard if you're using quite a stable fabric like cotton or linen. Okay, so I've left a gap at the start and finish to thread the elastic through, and I'm just using a safety pin here. So we're using 1/4 inch or 6mm wide elastic, and so your channel really needs to finish a little bit more than that. So it'll be around about 8mm, which is a bit more than 1/4 inch. So I've overlapped the ends of the elastic together, and I'm just doing a hand stitch to close it because it's a bit fiddly to do it at the machine. Just ensuring that the elastic is not twisted. And there you've got a nice little gathered cuff, and then you can just close that gap over at the machine. Just do a little back tack over that gap. And here is the finished garment. I've been over to the iron and I've given the garment a lot of steam to set those gathers, and here it is all finished. If you want to see my other patterns, please head over to my store on Etsy.com. Thanks very much for watching.